This is the Royal Roundup. I'm John Levy. I'll be visiting today with Brian Martinez of Honey Badger Radio. We'll discuss gunfire on movie sets, the end of craft beer, Facebook getting punched around, and three men who identify as one woman. But first, let me tell you about Roil. Roil is a better way to enjoy content online. You just tell Roil which internet content you like, such as YouTube channels, podcasts, and more. And then you can access them all in one place, the Roil app. There's too much to explain here, but Roil provides a new model that is the solution to today's problem of monopoly online. It does this using the time-tested concept of interconnection, which was used to end the AT&T telephone monopoly years ago. Click on the first link below to learn more. Roil is just getting started, but it's going to be big. Be among the first to discover Roil. Brian Martinez, hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. We have a nice lineup of stories to get to, so why don't we just jump into it? The first story is on this developing Alec Baldwin shooting incident that I'm sure that everybody has heard of. Alec Baldwin was in the process of filming an independent Western called Rust, and there was an accidental shooting that killed somebody involved in the camera work and injured the director. The way it's been described, I'm a fan of Western movies, and so he's practicing drawing the gun and pointing into the camera, right? Nothing could be more classic in a Western movie, right? That the grizzled cowboy whips out the gun, shoots it straight into the camera. But then when you think about the idea it's a live round, what a nightmare, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
straight at the camera operator, and I'm sure the director's huddled right behind, right in the zone. And
Mm-hmm.
so a terrible tragedy, and it makes me think differently about all those shots all those clips in Westerns where the gun goes straight into the camera and you see the puff of smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the latest development that just came out earlier today centers on the armorer, which is a term that I think people are newly familiar with. The idea that the movie industry has armorers who are responsible for specifically the firearm props. And this is now centering around this young woman, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, who was the armorer on this film. And the recent news that's coming out that it appears she has given what the sheriffs are saying may be false statements surrounding the presence of live ammunition on the sets.
Yeah. So the armor statement was inaccurate, which I did look at the story. There was a live round struck. I'm sorry, and killed Mrs. Hutchinson. So it is not an accurate statement, which is to say, Hannah Gutierrez said that should have been no live ammunition on set at all. But what it turns out is that, so let's I'll just put a couple of other things out there so people got a better idea of why things may have turned out the way they did, which is unfortunate. It's a tragedy. Number one, the film was a very low budget film. It was made on a shoestring budget. Alec Baldwin was one of the producers, so I guess this is a project that he was interested enough to put his money where his mouth was. But even then, it doesn't have a massive budget. So things like CGI, which could have been something that they could have substituted the gunfire for, was a bit out of the question. I guess the cost of those kinds of special effects is still a little bit too high right now. And instead, they wanted to go for essentially practical effects. And my understanding is that another thing about prop weapons, like prop guns, most of the guns that are used in films that we call prop guns are actually real guns that can fire real bullets. But whenever you take anything and use it to make a movie, then you call it a prop. So, it doesn't really have, it doesn't necessarily suggest whether or not the item in the film is meant to function, or not. So they were using real guns, which is common, and they usually fire blanks. But blanks are still dangerous, because there's still a tremendous amount of force to make the gun appear as though it's firing bullets, as well as, the gases have to escape from somewhere. So this is, in case somebody was thinking, well, why would you use a real gun? And, why weren't they using blanks? I think the intention was to use blanks. But to further confuse things, it appears that there were, and this is just what I heard, I think the last time I reported on this story, that the gun that was handed to Alec Baldwin had most recently been used for target practice. So, they have this kind of, again, it's a low budget film. There's a lot of loosey-goosey stuff going on. A lot of inexperienced people, like the armorer, whose name is, just so I don't forget, Hannah Gutierrez Reed. I believe that she was the daughter of another armorer that had more experience. I'm not necessarily going to call nepotism. I don't think that's necessary because, again, this is really about a failure to follow protocol that sort of, went down a number of steps. So I believe that 4 different crew members, including Alec Baldwin himself, had an opportunity, and by extension, or more accurately, they had an obligation or responsibility to double check the prop before they used it. And at every stage, they didn't. And there were lots of other little mistakes. I think that at one point, Baldwin was handed the gun, and the armorer said cold gun on set or something like that, which is supposed to say it's not loaded, and this way people know, but it was. Or at the very least, it wasn't checked, because it could have been something as simple as like a tiny fragment of something else that could have struck and killed the person. This is actually what happened to Brandon Lee. Do you remember Brandon Lee?
I do, yeah, the Crow. Yes, I remember when that happened.
And that was also an unfortunate incident. I mean, there was a piece of a previously fired casing inside of the gun, and they used it as a thinking that, there's just blanks in here, it'll be okay. And it was that little piece that killed him. So
now this situation, though, I think is a whole galaxy worse than that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It was a blank. The gun had a flaw in it, that it had a piece of fragment stuck in it, in the Crow. Here, the idea that you would have live rounds and blanks just kind of floating around to be mixed up on the set. It seems to me that's what the armorer should be doing, is to prevent that from happening, to have an absolute clear rule, no live rounds anywhere near the set, where they could be accidentally put into guns. It is really a stunning thing to have happened. And I think that in the first few days of coverage of this story, most of the people were under the supposition that it must have been something like what happened in The Crow, that it was a blank, and the blank somehow propelled an unintended projectile. There's been speculation about what kind of liability would result from this. I think that for a civil matter, clearly there's going to be liability of the production company and maybe liability of some of the individuals. But the fact that we're dealing with what could only be described as recklessly allowing live rounds to be around this, to be anywhere near where they could make their way into this gun, the prospect of criminal prosecution just seems much more likely with that having unfolded. And there's an affidavit apparently that's referenced in this story that Miss Gutierrez Reed said that there should not have been any of these live rounds around there. The guns were in a safe. Few people had access to the combination to that safe. I think that the sheriff and the prosecutor's office will be looking very closely
Hmm.
at making a prosecution that's based on at least negligence, if not recklessness.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'm curious to see how this goes because I know that the discussion around what happened, there was a lot of people saying, essentially putting it on Baldwin because he's the guy that pulled the trigger, but I don't think that that's quite fair. I do believe that there should be a penalty, or Baldwin should suffer some kind of consequence, only because again that he was the last line of defense. He had the gun before it was time for the shoot, and no pun intended, and he didn't check it. So, if he had, he could have stopped it there, just as there was like a grip that had it. There was the armorer and all these other people. So we'll see how it goes. But, at the end of the day, as long as I think that there's like a just conclusion that comes out of it, I'll be pretty satisfied. This is something that did not have to happen. I think it's bad for everyone involved. And hopefully, people will want to learn more about gun safety before they try to make other, films like this, or at all get involved with guns.
And now this is switching gears a little bit on this story, but another thing that this brings to mind. So it's a tragic situation. Certainly there will be liability. Likely there will be charges. Seeing pictures of Alec Baldwin as the cowboy, he's all grizzled and
Hmm.
hard looking, just made me think, man, westerns. We've seen so many Cape movies. It seems like the movies have been in the doldrums. Wouldn't it be a great time to see a resurgence of westerns? And I know that current year politics, they might find a way to ruin westerns, to make really bad westerns. I don't doubt that. But the themes of westerns just seems like very pertinent. I would love to see, the themes of a solo guy generally on a quest, in exploring the uncharted landscape, the themes of hardness, which the cowboys have, with hardness being dignity within disposability. I would love to see an emergence of a new sort of uh, cowboy
Like a
genre. Just
trend.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think about like the Mandalorian, right? The Mandalorian was so popular. That's a cowboy story, right? Space cowboy, and it's cowboy where it takes it to the next level, where his hardness is to the degree that he doesn't show his face, right? It really takes the hardness piece of it, and puts a really strong symbolic representation on it. And I think that there's just so much more to explore there, and now would be a good time for some cowboy movies. And I hope that this incident doesn't prevent that from happening.
Oh, I'd definitely like to speak to that. So, I've talked about this before. As an artist myself, I have a major interest in stories. I think that they're really important. I think that stories in our culture are how we connect to each other. When we can't connect, like in a personal way, and everything goes in cycles and phases. So the Western was essentially it was sort of it evolved from the pulps of the time of like sort of the Great Depression, in the 1920s, and you had these stories they were short stories about detectives, about masked Avengers, about cults and horrors, but there was also a lot of cowboy stuff. And the cowboy genre is really popular in the United States, mainly because it's sort of like what we consider to be iconic symbolism of the United States. So when you think of cowboys, you usually think of the United States because that's where the genre comes from. But a lot of other cultures also are in their own way in love with them. This is the reason why Akira Kurosawa, who is a very well-known, probably the most famous Japanese film director of our time, would make his samurai films based on older westerns from the time of John Wayne and stuff like that. And then later his films were adapted and sort of they were inspiration taken from Kurosawa's films for spaghetti westerns of the 1960s, like the the I'm sorry, Clint Eastwood films is what I was trying to remember, or even Once Upon a Time in the West and things like that. And that's actually, it's funny because it feeds into itself. But these are stories about men carving their own way in the world, and perhaps in the process of that, they operate with a strong belief in a code of honor, and it is uniquely masculine in that way. But this is another thing that's sort of come out of the culture, whereas in the time of feudal Japan, samurai were operating within a code of honor because it defined their place in society, but it also had as an expression of their manhood, of their masculinity. And then when later directors saw that honor that was being expressed, which you can also trace back farther to, say, books like The Three Musketeers, for example. So this is not like a brand new concept, obviously, or even stories of knighthood. There are resurging or patterns that keep coming back, and this about honor is something that I think in particular boys and men like to see, but it's admired by everyone, and it gets repeated in cycles. So right now, yeah, there's a big trend of superhero films, but that's probably not going to be around for much longer. I've noticed that it's peaked a while ago, and people are sort of starting to look for their gratification elsewhere. And it's not just because of all the woke garbage that's in most of our popular culture, but I think it's also because, these trends can't go on forever. After a while, someone is ready for the next thing. They want, to see something different. This is why I believe the Dune movie, which is an adaptation of a series of books, which was the original space opera, or one of the oldest space operas. It was actually the inspiration for Star Wars and amongst many other things. This Dune movie is doing really well, and it's very popular with people because I think that they want that. They're looking for something else. And as long as those themes of, that you saw in Westerns, that you saw in samurai films, that you saw in even like kung fu movies from Hong Kong in the 1970s, chivalry was a theme that runs through all of them, and it's basically cross-cultural. And I think that is what people want. But I agree with you. I love Westerns, and I'm hoping that, we will see more of a significant quality. But I do think that it's kind of inevitable. I think the culture is demanding, or they're starting to say, I want more of this. And that's probably why Alec Baldwin did the project, honestly. He probably saw that there was, maybe a desire for this.
Yep, I agree. Um, are you interested in moving on to the next story?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, we can move on to the next
The
story.
next story. This is a scary notion here that they've turned a lot of things against us. But if beer turns against us, man, we're in a hard way, right? Didn't Homer Simpson say that beer is the cause of and solution to all of life's problems?
Yeah.
We can't lose beer. Um, no, this is a funny story, an interesting story. So this is from I don't think this is a very wide major website. It's from civil.eats.com, but it's a really interesting case study of the dog pile strategy of woke sort of cancel culture. So the claim here is craft beer faces a gender and race reckoning. Okay. An industry that has long touted its equity and progressive values is finally being forced to address its, quote, white dudes with beards problem. Huh. Okay, so somebody sounds intolerant. I don't know. I don't know if it's the craft beer industry, but someone's got a problem with white dudes with beards. Having a beard myself, I don't know how to take that. Um, so it kicks off in May 2021. An exasperated Brianne Allen had had enough. In a single morning, two different men had approached the now former brewer at Notch Brewing in Salem, Massachusetts, and questioned her craft beer credentials. Okay, that's the casus belli. That is the claimed wrong.
Mhm.
Two people, and it's interesting. She is a now former brewer.
That
I don't
was
know if this was enough to kill her dream of brewing, but she's not a dead ender. She's not a ride or die brewer. She maybe she had it in passing as an interest. And so this is one of the things that is so common in this kind of dog pile tactic, that all we have is conclusory statements. We don't know what these men said. Okay. Um, she says that they questioned her craft beer credentials. What does that mean? Is that they were at a craft beer event and they came up to her and said, "Hey, so how long have you been into craft brewing?"
yeah. Well,
How
that's
do you start a
probably enough.
conversation? How do you start a conversation at an event, right?
Yeah.
You see somebody, you want to be friendly, you talk. Are you questioning their credentials? We don't have a quote. Maybe everyone needs body cams, but so all we have is this conclusory statement that what happened was sexist.
Yeah.
No, no details at all. And so then she takes to Instagram and asks the question, "What sexist comments have you experienced?" And and she had at the time 2,200 Instagram followers, and according to Civil Eats, this kicked off the largest reckoning against misogyny the craft beer industry has ever seen. That's their claim, leaving her with nearly 60,000 new followers, as essentially other women piped in about other experiences. Now, note her Instagram post doesn't say anything about craft beer, doesn't say anything about the context of what she's talking about. Just, have you experienced any sexist comments? And apparently there was enough interest in people trying to share that it gained her 60,000 followers. And now the rest of the story sort of presumes proceeds from the presumption that craft beer is deeply problematic and needs to change. Now, I've only known a few guys I've only known a few people who brew their own beer, and they're all men. I don't know if the stores won't sell to women, but I suspect that this is showing a difference in interest. Okay, that men are mostly who drink beer, men are mostly who brew beer.
Yep. I
The
agree.
article go,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's fine. So the article goes on to point out that most of the people in craft brewing seem to be men, and then of course, because of the intersectional nature of the woke dogpile strategy, it needs to transition to the race question. Okay,
Hmm.
and most of the craft brewers tend to be white, and then it again, nothing really alleged to have happened. It's just that the people who built and sustained this industry were born mostly a certain way, and that's a problem, apparently.
Yeah.
The so the racial question is brought into it with through, let's see, this guy's name, Marcus Baskerville, um, who uh, who was involved in during the 2020 Black Lives Matter surge in something called Black is Beautiful, the BIB movement, which uh, asked craft brewers to label their beers with this BIB, sort of as a show of support of the Black Lives Matter things that were going on at the time. And he points out that of 8,500 breweries, 1,300 participated in the BIB. And now, to him, that's not adequate. He says that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
And then he further, or rather, the article goes on further to note that you'd be hard pressed to find new bottles of BIB in any store cooler. So basically, they're saying, look, so 1,300 craft brewers met the call, started selling with the branding that they were being asked for, but it didn't last forever. And so then the argument is that because not all of the craft brewers changed their branding in accordance with the social movement, and because it didn't last forever, therefore we have demonstrated a big problem in craft brewing. And again, this just gets to, it doesn't really take any evidence. And it's a demonstration that the way that this movement works is they can just latch on to any institution that sort of scans as archetypally male and point to it and dogpile. Here it's craft brewers who the article goes on to say further that it tend to be really people on the left, but that's not going to protect them. But it could be any industry. It could be dentists, could be butchers, could be dog catchers, whatever it is. If it scans archetypally male, the coalition exists.
Yep.
To launch the dogpile against them. That's what this article means to me.
Yes, and the race angle, the intersectional part of it, is not entirely relevant. It's just used to sort of further drive that home, because we generally have the idea is that the progressives believe that in general people have less sympathy for men and even less sympathy for white men. So if you can essentially accuse something of being too white and male, then you're going to get more people on your side than if you simply said it's too male. So this means that they have to constantly adjust what tools they use, but ultimately, and this is, I'm glad that you said this, it starts by looking at any sort of community, interest, business, industry, or whatever that scans as you put it, male. So it starts with that. For example, if there's too many male, deer hunters, or if there are too many male bowlers, in bowling clubs, or too many males in, you could name anything really, gun enthusiasts, doctors, like you said. And if they can, they'll use that as their starting point, and then they'll bring in someone who is an outlier, like a woman who happens to be interested in punk rock, for example, or a black woman that's interested in punk rock, which is even better because they use the intersectionality both ways. And they'll ask the person, oh, well, as a female black punk rock musician, have you ever heard anything sexist? And because the word sexism can be defined so broadly and so abstractly that it's meaningless, then of course a black woman punk rocker will find some incident and then invoke it and say, oh yeah, one time somebody came up to me and said, you're a punk rocker? I can't believe that. And of course that means it must be sexism and racism or something. And of course they use that. And ultimately what I've noticed, this is a pattern I've seen many, many, many times in just about all corners of our culture and society in some fashion. What I've noticed is what is considered to be sexist ultimately comes down to, is what was said something that I can choose to interpret as negative judgment? Even if there is no overt judgment happening, if I can interpret it as something that is critical of my involvement in something, and then I can somehow make that about my gender, then yeah, that makes it sexist. And so what I've noticed about progressives is that most of the thing that they engage in starts off with a desire to avoid judgment. Not only avoid judgment, but be celebrated and lauded for their immutable characteristics, regardless of what, it is that this is really about. So their merit doesn't matter, and to ask about merit is to essentially be judgmental, and the judgment is the thing that they're trying to avoid. And because I think it really makes them uncomfortable, because at the end of the day they want acceptance, but the problem is their methods of trying to get it often involve these threat narratives, and so it ultimately doesn't serve anyone, because it makes people, it turns them off. Like, they don't want to be around people like that. They're like, well, I guess the best way to describe it is how it's been described by many others. They're cry bullies, which means that they, act as though they're put upon while simultaneously demonizing entire demographics of people for their immutable characteristics. So,
Yeah, it is very interesting to try and probe the psychology of what is driving that cry bullying behavior and what is causing the coalitions to cohere in this way, where it's sort of like you're forming a coalition where what you have in common is your willingness to go after the same scapegoat. Um, and that's just becoming increasingly common.
yeah,
Now, as I said, this is a relatively marginal site, Civil Eats. This isn't a broad movement that they've kicked off. I wouldn't be surprised if there's maybe some beer festival or something like that they are timing this in order to try and hit. But this is sort of at the low level of things bubbling up,
yeah,
right? So there may be a story next year in a slightly bigger publication about, and in that publication they'll say craft beer has long been criticized. Craft beer has a long history, and the Civil Eats story will provide the basis for sort of a claim of, oh, this is something that has been known for a long time, even though, as I said, there's no evidence being brought to bear in the story. And I'd recommend anybody to read the story if they're doubting that. There's no evidence of anything actually wrong being done.
yeah. And
it's just
honestly,
a claim of, look, these are the
sorry,
people that we don't want to be predominant in this industry.
Yes, yes. And I had noticed that this is these kinds of stories about the brewing industry have been going on for a couple of years now, because I remember reading about this a few years ago where it was the same kind of thing, microbreweries are too male and they're too white. And the person who writes them is usually a woman who is involved in this, and she just doesn't like the fact that, it's not, I don't know, an equitable outcome. What I've noticed, though, and this is, you can pick any hobby or interest or industry like this, kind of a niche thing, and you'll find that there's always progressive types that are complaining about the demographic makeup of those interests, because it just so happens, for example, that men might be interested in that because they're willing to do the work and they feel strongly about it, and for whatever reason, when men take an interest in something, they can sort of drill down and really focus on it and excel as a result. But they do this everywhere. You can find this all over the place, and ultimately it just serves to, first, you create negative sentiment towards the people who built these industries. Like the whole independent microbrewery thing was started by white men who were interested in brewing their own beer, and then of those, a percentage decided they wanted to label it and sell it, and of those, a percentage of them were very successful at it. And so this whole IPA thing, became really popular, and people were no longer buying, Michelob and Schlitz and Old Style, but they were looking for these other companies like Fat Tires and things like that. But it's only because men took the risk and started it up front. And when it became, and this is the thing that I've noticed that's most interesting, whenever these things become, they kind of, all of the risk that needs to be taken in ahead of it becoming sort of mainstream and popular, once all of that is over and everything is comfortable, and we've reached a point where we have essentially considered things like, microbreweries and whatnot to be the norm, well, then all of a sudden these people come along and they say, well, I don't like the way that this looks. You guys should change everything so that I feel comfortable being a part of this community. And it is just, and the most funny thing about it is that this woman, Brienne Allen, is no longer involved in the industry. So it's like, well, did you have the the wherewithal to go through with this, or are you simply saying, well, the only way I could make it is if all the men in this particular community would step out of the way, and no more than that, they should lift me up and make me the star. And so it's like, well, why do you think you deserve that? And but yeah, you're right. Ultimately, this is about. And another thing is really fascinating about this is that you only see this kind of thing in industries that are like really comfortable and profitable and popular and trendy. It's never things like, I don't see any articles written about how there aren't enough female coal miners or female people working in the Department of Sanitation, or women working on oil rigs, or women that are, Alaskan crab fishermen or anything like that. It's always like, oh, there should be more women in, game design. There should be more women in microbreweries. There should be more women doctors, more women CEOs. It's always this, like, what is the job that I think is the most comfortable and the most profitable? Yeah, there should be more women in that.
Yeah, well, they choose the appealing targets.
Yeah.
Those other ones, they could be attacked on exactly the same basis, and maybe someday they will be. But they choose the more sort of glamorous, desirable properties first, not, to be there. Like, nice thing you built there. Now hand it over, or we'll call you names.
Yeah, it's like based on, there's something about the status that comes with a lot of these jobs. So they didn't really. I mean, you could say feminists have whined about there not being enough female doctors for many, many years. But now that we're in a period where we consider, or at least we're told to consider, people who work in the medical care industry to be heroes, well, now women want to be heroes. And so they're like, well, I want to be a hero. Why are there all men, the doctors? And of course, they also do that under the assumption that being a nurse, which is actually, I would argue, just as crucial a role in healthcare, they consider that to be beneath them. This is why they criticize the fact that there aren't more female doctors while not caring about whether or not there are enough nurses. And this is because I think that they see things in terms of the social value, or like the status of those things. This is why they care about, microbreweries, because I guess being a beer brewer, or maybe they would say that I remember now, there was an article written about the same thing, but it was for people who were grinding and processing their own coffee, because that's become a very cool, trendy thing that you see, in these sort of well-to-do coastal cities. And so these people are attracted to that because they want to be involved in whatever the cool thing is. So it's not even so much about what is the most appealing because of the comfort that it provides, because there are probably plenty of jobs that are pretty comfortable and not that difficult. But this is also about what is on everyone's mind, or at least in the bubble that they live in. It's another reason why, for example, and I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, but like the tabletop gaming hobby, which is like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, for decades and decades, it was considered to be a very low status thing, right? It was shamed if you didn't want to tell people that you were into Dungeons and Dragons in public because you didn't want to get bullied. So you kept it to yourself and you just did this with your friends. Well, in the last, say, 10 years or so, that whole thing has inverted. Now it's very cool. Hollywood movie stars are always coming out and confessing that they like to play these games, and all of a sudden it's become a very high status thing, or at least it has the veneer or illusion of being a high status thing.
It's got a little shine on it.
Yeah, it's got a little shine on it, right? Like now Henry Cavill, who played Superman, is saying, "Oh yeah, I like Warhammer 40,000," or and Vin Diesel would say, "Oh, I confess that I'm such a nerd. I like D&D," and it's like, yeah, but you're Vin Diesel. But anyway, you're not risking anything, But now that those have become very trendy, again, it's the same thing. These people move in, they say, "Oh, look at this is a great hobby. I totally like this just as much as all the other hobbies I'm really into, except there are an awful lot of men here and I don't like that." And there's an awful lot
And
of
probably saying the same thing that she says at the beginning of this article, which is, "Oh, these guys questioning my credentials
yes, yes, exactly. And so it
of this
starts.
hobby that I started yesterday."
Yeah, it starts with that where, and anywhere you go, like if you get into anything, you're going to get people, I wouldn't even say I wouldn't call it question your credentials, but they might ask you about the depth of your knowledge on a given topic depending on where you are contextually. So if I go to a
And you know
if I
what?
go to
You know
a
what? The people who are actually into it love that because they
yeah,
want to talk
because they
about the
want to
topic
talk
because they're
about it.
actually interested.
Yes, exactly. But like for example, if I go to a baseball game, and I'm there because I just want to experience the baseball game, but maybe I'm not into baseball. I don't follow the teams. I don't know the players' names, right? I don't understand RBIs. Like I just want to be a part of the experience. I just want to go to the game, eat some hot dogs, drink some beers, and have fun. And someone might ask me, like, "Well, what do you think about, so and so, or this, or the playoffs, or whatever?" Some sports ball question. I might just be honest and say, "Well, honestly, I don't really know much about it." And I don't think they're going to say, "Well, you can't be here. You need to get out." Like, instead, they're probably going to say, "Oh, well, what, you became interested. You're here now. So let's talk," right? This is just like any other hobby. If the people feel strongly about the thing that they love, and someone who doesn't know as much shows up and they ask them about their knowledge, odds are, and I would bet, you know, uh, whatever amount of money that they're asking because they're enthusiasts and they want to meet other enthusiasts. And if it turns out that person is not an enthusiast, or at least they're just getting into it, I think that they would get very excited at the prospect of being able to be their guide in this world of their, whatever their interest is. So
Right. Or maybe they'll be like, "Oh, this is a noob. There's not that much interesting to say to him," and that's fine.
yeah,
That's not a male, female, or racial thing.
no,
That is
no.
just, are you interested? Do you speak this hobby?
Exactly. I mean, could you imagine if some website wrote an article that said that hip hop music is too black and it needs to change? I mean, obviously they would never do that because they would see that as a terrible, terrible thing to say, but they feel fine saying it about anything else that involves mostly men, but specifically white men, because that's usually how you get your foot in the door before you start making it about all men. So they wouldn't do it.
All right. So this is the story of what they're trying to bubble up as a conflict of dogpile. And next up, we have one where it's very much here. The dogpile is here.
Hmm.
So shall we move on to the Facebook story?
Yeah, let's take a look at the Facebook story.
Let's not do the Forbes. Let's do
Okay,
let's
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 do
skip the
this
Forbes
one,
and do the other one.
the
Yeah.
Zuckerberg one. Okay.
Okay. So if people have not been paying attention to this story, there is a what can only be described as an ongoing sort of coordinated attack against Facebook that has arisen through um, the initial player here is a so-called whistleblower named Francis, and I might mispronounce her last name. I apologize for that, but I'm going to call it Haugen. I think Francis Haugen. That's how I would read it.
That looks right.
And okay, and so she was an employee at Facebook, stole a bunch of company records, uh, turned those over to Congress as a purported whistleblower. We haven't seen any real smoking guns come out of that. It's all very vague, the accusations that are arising here. Um, and so she's also been shown to be a long-term Democratic contributor and has been working with I think it's a lobbying firm or a law firm that's very connected in the Democratic Party. And so she was very, it appears, coordinated the positioning of her as a whistleblower to then testify to Congress about how Facebook is very, very bad. And so now here we have in this story, Zuckerberg responding sort of as he had to. It doesn't seem like he went out of his way to respond here, because these are comments that were arising out of the company's third quarter earnings call. So this is a call that was going to happen anyway. So he was sort of addressing the topic that's in the air during the call that was otherwise going to happen. And so the framing of this article is Facebook's algorithm promotes hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracies. Now, I'm a programmer, and I think that algorithm it's a funny word to throw out there because it could be anything. And what this calls to mind to me is the idea of, you know what, I hate mirrors because their algorithm makes me look ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And the algorithm is that it takes all of the light coming in and sends it right back out. And that's what Facebook's algorithm does generally too. It takes people's interests and gives them their interests. So Facebook is very much, as all of these social media platforms tend to be, very much revealing the truth about what people are interested in. It is a mirror that is held up on society. And Zuckerberg, in his comments, says, good faith criticism helps us get better, but my view is what we are seeing here is a coordinated effort to selectively use leaked documents to paint a false picture of our company. And the picture that is sort of articulated in the article is of a company that prioritizes profits over user safety. Now, user safety is a very funny term to use with respect to Facebook. Like, I could understand if it's a car company and they're like, we're not going to invest very much in brakes. We want to make our brakes as cheap as possible. I could understand that as, okay, you're prioritizing profits over user safety. Facebook is allowing people to share things that they're interested in. User safety does not seem like a very apt characterization. It goes on to quote a former employee saying that the company has, quote, often resorted to aggressive tactics in the name of growth. And color me shocked. I mean, this is a company that has grown tremendously. Really, a company is trying to grow, and they use, quote unquote, aggressive tactics. Again, nothing specific, just sort of hazy buzzwords trying to cast it in a negative light. Zuckerberg response is that the issues aren't primarily about social media, and no matter what Facebook does, we're never going to solve them on our own. And so that is, again, getting to the point that this is Facebook reflecting back people's interests, and user safety, the way that it's being sort of constructed by Facebook's critics in this vein is, look, we don't want everybody to be able to share their interests. We don't want everybody to be able to see what they're looking for. We only want the information that we agree with to really be shared, and we would characterize any violation of that as threatening user safety.
Yep.
And Facebook has billions of users. Obviously, you're going to be able to find examples of people who would say, for maybe that that they became depressed more if they used Facebook. Now, people become depressed in all kinds of avenues in life. All types of life experiences might hit people negatively, but there's a real. I have not seen a showing of Facebook doing anything other than reflecting people's interests back, and that Facebook does seem to have taken real serious steps to try to prevent things that they can really tangibly identify, like things that might promote eating disorders, things that might promote suicide. That AI would have the ability to identify, and I think that there is a place for something like, I don't think that Facebook needs to be a free speech platform. I have a social media platform, Roil. I wouldn't characterize it as a free speech platform. I think that there are some things that that you just don't have to host. But what we're seeing here does seem to be like a coordinated pressure campaign, politically motivated, to shape what people are allowed to see on Facebook.
Mm. Yeah, and well, from the beginning, I was really suspicious of this whistleblower because when I saw that what she was essentially making the case for was that Facebook wasn't doing enough to keep people safe online, which basically means they're not censoring enough, and they need to do more. That well, that's how I knew that there was something about this that doesn't it does not pass the sniff test for me. But like, I'm not also saying that Facebook has to be an absolute free speech platform. I think that my personal values when it comes to free speech are quite radical compared to even the average pro free speech person. But and so I wouldn't expect that people would have the same values that I do when it comes to that. But at the same time, what I think is really funny about this is that even though Facebook is probably less censorious than, say, Google, Twitter, and other similar social media sites, it does have its own obvious bias, but also its own. I'm sorry. My phone was heard my voice and thought I was talking to it.
Facebook realized well, no, Facebook heard us.
Yeah, that must be the case.
And kicked that off.
That's weird. But yeah, so instead they have this thing where they deploy fact checkers on a short list of topics that they think is really important to control the narrative around. I won't mention them here because I don't really know how, but I think if you're on Facebook, you know what I'm talking about. And they obviously have, their own their own values that they think are important, that they think that there should be an expert opinion on, and that people should not be peddling conspiracy theories as they define it. But at the same time, though, I have to give Mark some credit for not simply banning everyone off of the platform for disagreeing, but instead sort of spamming us with fact checkers. And I think that that's the reason why Facebook is in hot water, because essentially there are people who think Facebook should be far more censorious than they are, and they're invoking this kind of what we call it on my other show that I host called Honey Badger Radio. We talk about this phenomenon, and we call it the unconscious feminine. And what the unconscious feminine is, it's not unique to women. So that's the first thing we should put out in front. Men have a feminineness to them as well. Women are obviously far more, embody far more of that. But what it is essentially the difference between valuing liberty or valuing security. And in the when you're in the unconscious feminine, which is essentially it's like a motherly a valued approach, right? That comes from a motherly place. You are trying to protect people from harm, and you prioritize the protection of people from harm over liberty, over freedom, and over choice. And we all start moving in this direction, and it's usually revolving around trying to protect women from harm specifically, but not exclusively. It just comes down to we basically stop valuing liberty, we stop valuing freedom, we find freedom to be dangerous, perhaps too dangerous, and then we start focusing on security and safety. And so this is where we are now. I think that it's only going to get worse. Because we have lost sight of the value of liberty at this stage, and why we need actually with liberty you can get security, but a lot of people don't really believe that. And I think that there's a number of factors that have led to this, but I think this is really what we are experiencing on social media, in our government activities, in our mainstream media, all over the place. is this unconscious feminine that has permeated all aspects of our civilization, and it's basically
See,
driving
it's a
us.
it's a very interesting concept. I'd love to talk to you about it more another time. But the idea of, okay, we have this unconscious feminine, and I used the term earlier today, archetypally male,
Yeah,
and I think that that it's only reasonable to think that in our brain we have sort of these constructs of archetypally feminine, archetypally male, and you can see we've evolved under these circumstances where these are the two groups in our population. You can see in so many languages, it's so deep down into our thinking that so many languages just by default are masculinizing or feminizing objects, inanimate objects around them, right? It goes that far down into
yep,
our, into the structure of our brain. And I think that we have gotten to a point where we have almost a like a self-imposed ignorance of this aspect of our own thinking, right? That if the goal is to know thyself, well, we have turned a blind eye to this part of ourselves, and so that's a really deep and interesting topic that again I don't think we have time to talk about now, but I'd love to explore that with you another time.
yeah,
You
definitely.
also mentioned the topic of free speech. How pro free speech should one be? And this is um, it's also a really hard topic. I used to think. Okay, so first of all, there's the distinction between government regulation speech and private regulation speech,
Sure.
and I used to lean. Well, let me say, used to is not the right term, but I recognize that free speech is a good idea for governments for the same reason that it's a good idea. Excuse me, free speech is a good idea for companies or venues of communication for the same reason that it's a good idea for governments. And I think that that's true. But I also think that government regulation of speech is just a much more live wire
Absolutely.
than if we have companies that are in a position of having to decide, well, do I want to host this type of content? And I think that so there was a time when I thought, well, anything that's First Amendment protected, which is extremely broad, and I'm glad that it's extremely broad, um, should be allowed on a social platform. And now I don't know. Now I have sort of I'm sort of thinking of that as that's not taking the problems as seriously as I needed to really take it. And I am now in a position because I have Royal as a social platform, and I need to think, well, do I want to host doxing, for example?
Hmm.
That's a good example. Doxing is perfectly legal, but I don't think that it's appropriate activity. I don't want to host it on Royal, and that's a very easy example. But I think that I don't know. I have come to appreciate that the challenge that Zuckerberg is having
Yeah.
in terms of, well, what regulation should there be? It's more textured than what I had initially thought,
Mhm.
and that the flippant answer isn't necessarily the flippant answer, which is anything and everything. That's not necessarily the right answer. As hard as it is for me to have to come around to that view.
No, I actually agree with you. I think that the purpose of free speech, it should be a value that we all carry, but in terms of how it should play out from the state and private individuals is a little bit different. And what I mean is the state should not interfere. It should not make speech laws at all, because once if you give that much authority to the government, the first thing it's going to do is essentially ensure that you can't criticize it, and then it just
one Hundred
gets and
percent.
it gets worse from there. But the difference with individuals or private citizens and companies is that the free speech is also part of the freedom of association freedom, which I think is as important as freedom of speech. So a company should not be coerced, because the only way you could enforce absolute free speech on private citizens is, again, using the state, which I don't want to give the state that much authority over other people. So the best thing to do is to allow people to decide for themselves what it is that they want to be exposed to or what they want to host. And we have to let them decide, even if we don't agree with them, that that is what they want, and then leave them alone. I think of, a very popular example that comes up a lot is the baker. I believe that was the baker who was being coerced into baking
the championship cakes thing.
Yes, the cake for the gay couple, and he had a religious belief against it. And to me, it's a very simple thing. Why was this couple so hell bent on making him express their sentiment on a product? Well, this is why it turned into a free speech issue, at least the way I see it. I don't know what that guy's, religious beliefs are, and he could very well be very homophobic and a huge bigot. But personally, I don't think that's important. I think that it's the least important thing regarding that, because if you force someone to make something for you because you think that it's some kind of poetic justice to make some bigot create something for you, you're still paying them, and so you're rewarding that behavior. If you feel so strongly about it, you should literally take your business somewhere else. And that person, no one is hurt by that, right? I mean, unless, again, and I go back to the first story we talked about, I think it was the first story. No, it wasn't the first one. It was the craft beer story, about how all of this seems to always come back to a desire to control people so that the offended party does not feel judgment. And so this goes back to judgment. If there is a whatever Mark Zuckerberg's values are, which I imagine are more, favorable to left-wing bias, he might have a problem with transphobia. And so the way that he acts out on that is the algorithm looks for people who might use certain buzzwords that could be considered, even if we can't really know what's in people's hearts, but it could be considered transphobic. And so those people get suspended. That's informed by his own bias. But I think that it's his right to have that because it is his platform. The only thing is that I think would maybe help people out is not necessarily to demand that Mark Zuckerberg be a absolute free speech platform, because I don't think that. I think, first of all, we're going to be fighting about what absolute free speech means, even though I think it really is kind of clear what it means. But also because we would be, again, putting a private citizen in a position where they no longer have freedom of association, which I think is as important as freedom of expression. And so that's basically where I'm coming from. I'm okay with Mark Zuckerberg having this bias, just like Jack Dorsey or any of these other folks. But I do think it would be much better for everyone involved if they were just upfront about it.
That's a really interesting analysis.
Yeah.
So we're an hour in. Shall we move on to the last story, which is the Spanish author?
Oh yeah, I love this story. Let's do it.
Okay, this is a funny story. It's so funny how this story, it hits the notes on both sides, right? It hits the notes on both sides. So do you want to introduce it?
Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, so one of Spain's most celebrated female authors turned out to actually be three men. And so there was this pseudonym name, and this is in Spain, by the way. I don't know if I said that already. There was a pseudonym, an author named Carmen Mola, and she was a very popular author that sold over 400,000 books, won a €1 million Planeta Literary Prize, and was essentially about to be given this award. And it was like this, they had this big award ceremony, and they were announcing this person, and it was like the $1 million or €1 million prize. So it's like the top honor at this particular event, and everyone involved was expecting a woman to go up to accept the award. And of course, they made a big stink out of it too. They said, "Oh, it's the first woman, and it's going to be, it's going to be so amazing to see more female authors." And these three men go up on the stage to accept the award. And Mola, by the way, who was famous for penning thrillers that have been adapted for television, so this is a really big deal, was operating obviously under this synonym of these three dudes. Now, the one thing I do want to say about this before I hand you the floor so you can give your thoughts, that I actually love about this is feminists have been writing for decades that female writers cannot rise to the same level as male writers unless they use a male pseudonym. So, there have been some, I think that Karen Strawn, my friend from Honey Badger Radio, has done this too. She has a pseudonym, and I believe that her pseudonym might be male, but I don't hold me to that. But there have been other women who have used male pseudonyms, or at the very least have tried to sort of conceal their gender by using initials or something like that. And part of it was because...
But what comes to mind for me is J.K. Rowling, after she got famous for Harry Potter, started writing spy thrillers under Robert Galbraith, and then later came out that it really was J.K. Rowling.
Yes. So you see what I'm saying. This is a pattern that's occurred over and over, and the idea is...
Though for her, she was a big enough name, I think, that she could have sold books under her.
Oh, absolutely. She probably didn't have to do that. But in many other cases, yeah, it's the women writers feel as though they can't make it on their own, so they make their names into a male pseudonym. And then
it's kind of funny considering that don't women buy far more books than men? It's kind of a strange supposition that they would be making.
It is. I think that in general, women are more interested in fiction and men are more interested in nonfiction, but women, I think, overall read more books. But yeah, it is an interesting supposition to make. And I think it's just one of these things that's just always been around, and so we just kind of accept that. And so this is an inversion of that, and I think it's fantastic because I would wonder if these men would have won this award if they were writing under their actual names. Because Spain is a very feminist country, and they usually work really hard to promote women in every instance, at least from their media and their government. So I would wonder about that. So, but hey, on the plus side though, feminists can claim, if they wish, that it takes 3 men to make 1 woman. So they could do that.
Oh, that's a good one.
They could do that.
That's a good one. See, when I look at this story, I think it's a funny one because both sides are popping off about it.
Yeah.
And in a sane world, this would be nothing. Okay, it's a non-story in a sane world. So on the one side, there's people saying, "See, the best women writers really men," right? That's silly. Women, they're great women writers. This one, it happened to be men writing under pen name, but there's no reason this couldn't have been women. So I think it's silly, but but that's how the men's side is popping off on it, and on the women's side, popping off on it is let's see. So they're mad because they feel tricked. It's like, and this is from the article. So these men were working under a pseudonym, and the author's website promoted the writer as a 40-something university professor and mother of 3 who greatly valued her privacy. And the critics of these men are saying, no, it's not just the name. You had this profile, this identity that got us all wrapped up and interested in this person. And it's like, wait, that university professor and mother of 3 values her privacy, that's it? Mm-hmm. This was not like, this is somebody who's got international spy knowledge. This person is a real like insight. There's nothing in the profile to make it seem like, oh yeah, this is going to be somebody who's got the goods, right? It's just a professor, mother of 3. And the article goes on to note, Spain's Women's Institute includes one of the books on a list of female authors that, quote, help us understand the reality and experiences of women. And it's just like, well, if that's true, then why couldn't you tell? Right?
Yeah.
So if...
Yeah, it's like, it's funny because these men were writing about women's experiences as men, and the women bought into it because it was very successful. So it's almost like you don't actually have to be a person of a certain gender or race or whatever for other people to be able to, tell a convincing story about that person's experiences.
I mean, I guess that it also provides a um, like a natural experiment on the question of, do people buy women's author books or men's author books? Because the question is, so is the next book going to be a huge hit? Because everybody knows now that it's men, and it's like, oh, thank goodness it's a man one. Now let's really buy this book.
Yeah,
Or was there no effect? Is it going to be, or is it going to be less of a hit because people wanted it to be written by a woman?
that's a good question. I suspect that like a normie, is probably not going to care because they like the stories or they may not even know about this. I don't know how widespread this story is and how many people know about it, but I think that it's an interesting thing to think about. I'd like to follow up with this later to see if they still have jobs, to see if they got canceled for lying to women about what they were. I mean, I think it's a little bit, gauche to presume all of their genders myself because you never know, right? But I guess it's if it serves them, they will do that. But yeah, good on them. I think this is hilarious.
All right. Well, Brian, we've been an hour 10. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me to talk. Let's do this again sometime
We
soon.
will, absolutely. Yeah, I thought it was fun.
All right. Cheers. Take care. Thank you for watching. You can download the Royal app at your app store by searching for Roil, spelled Roil, technology. Or you can sign up at roil.com. Again, Roil. We'll see you there.